All right, hello everyone. This is Caitlin Coleman with Water Education Colorado. Thanks for joining us today for our webinar, Forests, Fires, and Watershed Health. The program complements and expands on the content in our latest issue of Headwaters magazine, which is focused on public lands. You can find the magazine and learn more about us at yourwatercolorado.org. And we're about to launch a brand new website, so very soon, in the next week or so, you'll be able to find us at watereducationcolorado.org. I have just a couple of housekeeping notes before we get started. The webinar will last for about 1 hour. As attendees, you'll be muted throughout the presentation, as you are right now. If you have questions, please type them into the questions pane in your GoToWebinar toolbar, which should be on the side of your screen. We'll reserve about 15 minutes at the end of the webinar to address any unanswered questions, which I'll read aloud so our speakers can respond to them. The webinar is being recorded, and I'll email it to you all next week. And if you have any technical questions during the webinar, for example, if you're having trouble hearing us, you could type them into the questions pane, and I'll be checking those questions, and we'll do our best to resolve them, though it's not always possible. So let's get started. Forest fires have become increasingly frequent and intense across Colorado and the West. A report by the Colorado State Forest Service and Colorado Water Conservation Board projected that by 2050, we'll see a 50 to 200% increase in the area burned in Colorado each year. And those fires are becoming more costly as well, with more than 50% of U.S. Forest Service costs going toward fire management. While these fires pose a public lands challenge and safety challenges, they can also affect our drinking water. As we reported in Headwaters, 80% of Coloradans drink water that flows out of national forest land alone. So what do we do? So we're here today to discuss the challenge and also partnerships and funding strategies that could help Colorado build healthier forests, watersheds, and more secure communities. We're joined today by our panelists. Steve Lohr with the U.S. Forest Service, Rob Addington with the Nature Conservancy, and Ellen Roberts, a former state senator and now Colorado State Forest Service consultant. So we'll start off by hearing from Steve. Steve has been working with the U.S. Forest Service since 2002, and he's served there in many capacities. Most recently, Steve was the director of the National Partnership Office in Washington, D.C. from 2014 to 2016, where he worked to build the agency's capacity surrounding partnerships, as well as maintain and develop new national level partnerships. He's currently the director of renewable resources for the Rocky Mountain region and has responsibility for the forest management, wildlife, range, water, and air programs. So Steve, take it away. You should be unmuted now.
All right. Thank you, Caitlin. I appreciate the invite to participate in the webinar. This is a critically important topic for the Forest Service, given our critical linkage, or the critical linkage between forests and watershed health. So just quickly today, I'm going to run over a little bit about what national forests mean to your water, our current challenges with fire, and as well as our restoration needs, and emphasize some of the excellent work we're doing with partners as well, and talk about how we can do more. So those are kind of the areas I'm going to cover. So as Caitlin identified, 80% of the water in Colorado that folks are using comes from our 7 national forests and 2 national grasslands, or originates from those lands. So, particularly in the West, national forests and public lands in general play a really, really key role in water supply. And so watershed protection is at the very core of our mission. We are really focused on work that's going to increase our resiliency in those watersheds. In the past, as when the Forest Service was first established, there was a largely hands-off approach to management, given the tremendous cutting that occurred, at the turn of the century. And so the Forest Service was largely in a suppression mode for, 100 years. And And so now we're in a situation where we have forests that have grown back up like we wanted them to, but now they're pretty thick, and it's in places very difficult to manage now. And you couple that with a lot of people moving in, and it makes it a really challenging management situation for us. So we are not really referring to fire seasons anymore. We're referring to the fire year, because we've had fires just about every month of the year now, and they just seem to increase in frequency, size, and severity. So and then, it's really 1 to 2% of the fires that escape initial attack that become these big long duration fires that account for 30% of the greater than 50% of the Forest Service budget that Caitlin mentioned. Fortunately, Congress recently, with the passing of the omnibus bill, provided some language in that bill that will reduce the likelihood of the disruptive practice of transferring funds from other non-fire programs to cover firefighting costs. And that legislation will kick in 2020, which will really help us with the work that we're doing on the landscape. But fire is a big part of how our agency operates and how we manage. But we recognize the critical importance between the condition of our forests and downstream water supplies, and we're working internally and externally with many partners to really make a difference. And my time in DC I spent with a bunch of great partners, and since I've moved here to Colorado, it's amazing how much we can accomplish with partners. So just in general, the restoration needs in Colorado, the Colorado State Forest Service issued a report, I think it was early last year, that talked about 834 million dead trees were in Colorado based on the recent bug epidemics. And so, nationally on Forest Service lands, kind of step it up to that level, we estimate that there's between 65 and 82 million acres in needs of treatment. And what does that mean for Colorado? Probably around 2 million acres that have high priority treatment needs. And really, if we wanted to put a dent in it, we'd need to treat about 350,000 acres a year. And last year we treated 63,000 acres. So we're proud of that 63,000 acres, but it's a long way. We have a long way to go. So some of the things that I think are important is increasing our use of managing wildfires. Last year in Colorado, we managed 21,000 acres of wildfires. So basically what that means is we're not thinking suppression immediately where it's appropriate. And we are using other tools like prescribed fire, and then also, we're treating a lot of acres with timber harvesting. So last year we spent about $41.5 million on bed treatments in Colorado, and over the last 5 years in Colorado we've spent over $160 million. So we're working hard to make change there. So as I mentioned, working with partners is key, and I'm not going to walk through every partner on here, but there is a whole ton of them that we're working with in Colorado. A lot of water utilities and Colorado State Forest Service and other partner federal agencies as well. And we're really looking at aligning our priorities with those of our partners to get a lot more work done. Just to identify a couple of interesting partnerships with our utilities. Since 2009, Watershed Investment Partners have invested $29 million and plan to invest another $22 million by fiscal year 2021 for a total investment of $51 million, which is going to be matched by the Forest Service, or has been and will be matched with the Forest Service, to get an investment of over $100 million. And that work is treated in excess of 67,000 acres as of the end of 2017. This work is hazard fuel removal, prescribed burns, wetland and riparian restoration, and invasive species work, and then also planted over 1 million trees. So are the treatments working? Well, this is a good example, this picture. We've had a couple of incidents here recently where we had major wildfires threatening communities, and First one is the Cold Springs fire near Nederland that was only suppressed basically due to fuel breaks that were installed or that were put into place that allowed firefighters to have some defensible space to catch that fire. This picture is just from June 12th. We had a fire up near Silverthorne, the Buffalo fire, and this one was trucking towards those condos and homes that you see there, and we had a big fire break there, a fuel break there, and it caught that fuel break. They estimated that there was about $913 million of infrastructure that fire would have spread to within a 72-hour window if those fuel breaks hadn't been in place. So just a little bit about some of the other things that we're doing. We have Farm Bill, the 2014 Farm Bill authorized the Good Neighbor Agreement Program. The Colorado State Forest has been an excellent partner for us. We've invested over $2 million in Good Neighbor Authority work in Colorado through 9 agreements, and we've committed an additional $300,000 to really look at expanding those opportunities with the Colorado State Forest Service. In order for us to really align our priorities with our partners, each forest in our region is looking at producing 5-year veg management plans that really has a goal of facilitating integration with the states so that once our priorities are aligned, we can really maximize our outputs and outcomes for the investments that we make, because we can leverage each of our investments. We also have, there's a lot of efforts around improving planning efforts, and categorical exclusion was a part of the 2014 Farm Bill. It authorized us to do increased acres, treat increased acres in categorical exclusions. The omnibus bill that helped us with our fire funding also expanded some G&A authorities to include road work, which is really helpful for us, and also expand stewardship, long-term stewardship contracts from 10 to 20 years. This is on top of some authorities we've already had and we've been using. The Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program. There's 2 active projects in Colorado, one on the Front Range and then one on the Grand Mesa National Forest and Uncopadre Plateau. So we're working on those, and those have produced really good results for us. Over 80,000 acres of fuels treatments and 8,000 acres of reforestation. So that's been doing really good for us. So we're also trying to up our game around investing more with partners. We co-funded a position with the Nature Conservancy that's going to pilot a water fund model, and so that water fund model essentially is really working to find outside restoration financing for public and private lands in Colorado, and really looking at how that model could work here. We also have got an agreement right now with Colorado State University on a feasibility study for the Front Range of Colorado that really has a goal of determining how to reduce costs of expensive treatments on the Front Range. Some of our treatments now are approaching and exceeding $3,000 an acre, which is really not a sustainable figure. It just costs too much money to get that work done. So this study is designed to look at market development and what types of opportunities could be available to reduce those costs. The agency is undertaking 2 major modernization efforts right now around environmental planning and forest products delivery. Planning and execution are the 2 biggest pieces of time and money that we spend, so we're trying to increase those efficiencies. And then the other thing that our region has done is developed a regional water board, and the goal of that water board is to make it, enable the Forest Service to be a bit more strategic and effective around water and planning in the water environment, and trying to improve customer service, and really trying to connect with the states and address big picture, strategic, forward-thinking topics, and really figure out how the agency can contribute to the state water plans. This is a good picture of some of our challenges. I mentioned the 834 million dead trees earlier, but so you see the needs on the landscape, and we're trying to adjust our planning needs to address these large landscapes. So we've had a couple examples recently of really large planning documents. One that comes to mind is the spruce beetle epidemic and aspen decline management response project, which is a mouthful, but It does cover a lot of acres. That's on the GMUG, the Grand Mesa Uncompadre Gunnison National Forest, and that's really an 8 to 12-year program of work for us that covers more than 10,000 acres. So we just realize efficiencies when we plant at these high levels. And we are, the reason we're doing this ultimately is to get more acres treated on the landscape. So we're really trying to increase the upward trend, or continue the upward trend of work we've done in Colorado and other states. So, to close out, I think the work that we've done in partnership with, the many water utilities and state and federal partners and many communities is really a key piece for us, and we can't do it without partnerships. It's just there's too much work that needs to occur to do it without partnerships, and really we want to build on the existing relationships and develop new ones to get more done on the landscape. And our goal here is to be a really good neighbor and understand and respect the type of priorities that our partners have, so we can really align our priorities with that of our partners. So appreciate the opportunity to talk today, and looking forward to continuing the relationship with a lot of our partners in Colorado's water community. So I'll pass it back to Caitlin.
All right, thanks, Steve. So next I would like to introduce Rob Addington. He is a landscape ecologist with the Nature Conservancy in Colorado. Rob specializes in the restoration and management of fire-adapted forests, with emphasis on spatial planning, as well as research and monitoring of forest restoration aimed at reducing hazardous fuels, promoting landscape resilience, and enhancing ecosystem services. Rob has nearly 15 years of professional experience working in frequent fire ecological systems. Rob, let me unmute you.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Rob.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you, Caitlin, and thank you all for joining the webinar today. I'm excited to be here to talk about a project that we have going in the Upper South Platte watershed. And Steve did a really nice job of outlining kind of the bigger picture from the standpoint of the need for forest management related to wildfire risk in particular and water resource protection. And he did touch as well on the importance of partnership activities. And so what I want to do for my presentation is drill down a little bit more in focusing specifically on a partnership project in the Upper South Platte watershed. Are my slides advancing?
No, I still see your first slide.
Yeah, same here. Ooh.
There we go.
Okay, try again. Sorry about that. Just to reiterate some points that Steve made around what we've seen related to water resource impacts from some of the recent wildfires. They have been pretty severe in a lot of cases. We have several examples on the Front Range of fairly severe impacts related to Buffalo Creek Fire going back to 1996, the 2002 Hayman Fire, 2012 High Park and Waldo Canyon fires. And so it's a pattern that we're seeing more and more, and we expect to continue to see with future wildfire impacts. And the basic model that we're talking about related to forest management, this slide illustrates a no-action alternative versus an action alternative, with the no-action alternative on the left-hand side of the screen showing a high-severity wildfire with high-severity fire effects, high tree mortality, creating conditions for high soil erosion, sedimentation that then impact water resources and causes a lot of damage to the water resource and a lot of cost to a water utility, versus a forest treatment action where we go in, are proactive in the forest management that we do, subsequently changing wildfire behavior and preventing that soil erosion and sedimentation impact to water resources. So in the case of the Upper South Platte watershed, it is, of course, a really important watershed for the Denver metro area, in addition to a lot of other communities on the Front Range. It's just southwest of Denver, and it's outlined in this figure here in black. And what I have here is a drinking water risk layer from the Colorado Wildfire Risk Assessment Portal that shows statewide the areas of highest risk from a drinking water perspective. And you can see really the concentration of red in the Upper South Platte watershed. So in 2015, the Upper South Platte Partnership was formed. Numerous agencies and organizations came together with support provided by Denver Water, the U.S. Forest Service, and several corporations that were interested in water resource protection. I won't go through all the list of partners there, but you can see that it's a long list. And overall, the mission is to foster sustainable and resilient landscapes, healthy forests, and proactive fire-adapted communities within this watershed through active forest management. When I think about kind of the main themes or pillars of the Upper South Platte Partnership, I've been involved in it for a few years now, and the things that come to mind for me are really the importance of collaboration, the importance of bringing science to the process, both planning and prioritization processes, and then monitoring and adaptive management. There is a big emphasis on cross-boundary work. There's a wide range of land ownership within this watershed, so it's important that we work across boundaries, and then it's important that we not only work with the existing funding that we have, but that we continue to bring in additional funding to help support the work. So in terms of collaboration within the Upper South Platte watershed, benefits are around enabling us to have a very coordinated strategic approach, identifying what those priorities are up front, and then really being strategic in the way in which we come together to approach the priorities. It enables us to pool resources and expertise across our different agencies and organizations, so we have a wide range of disciplines that are represented by the different individuals that are involved, and it really enables us to kind of think fairly broadly about the problem and pool those resources and expertise. And then I think one of the most important things, Steve mentioned the need to really be working at a large scale when we're talking about forest management. By working together in this strategic fashion, I think it really enables us to scale up the treatment footprint across the different agencies and organizations. And then it has enabled us to take a very concerted outreach and education effort as well. The role of science has come in a number of ways. The things I want to highlight, one is around the planning and actually identifying what those priorities are. We did go through a fairly detailed and sophisticated wildfire behavior modeling process that coupled some wildfire behaviors with soil erosion models, information about the wildland-urban interface, and we were able to bring these different components together within a geographic information system to identify the highest priority areas within the landscape there. We continue to use the science to help us think about what the watershed looked like historically and how we could use some of the information about the condition of the forest from historical references to think about how we might design treatments going into the future, but with the idea that we want to be creating a landscape that's going to be very resilient to future climate as well. The science comes into play in terms of monitoring and adaptive management. We do have a very robust monitoring program in place led by the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute at Colorado State University, where we do monitoring at an individual project scale that we then try to roll up across the larger landscape to understand if we're in fact having the management outcomes that we're hoping for. And then as it relates to adaptive management, using that monitoring, learning from that monitoring, and having it guide the work that we do in the future. We also have kind of a research component to the science, and one interesting analysis we were able to undertake just in the last about year or so is a return on investment analysis that colleagues also at Colorado State University led for us, looking at the amount of treatment, how it's prioritized, and kind of what level of treatment needs to happen in order to realize a positive return on investment. And we were able to publish a paper on this in 2017 that basically showed a positive return on investment if we are very deliberate in how we define our values at risk, and we take a very strategic, prioritized approach to the management, and then again, if we treat at the scale that we need to be treating at. The cross-boundary emphasis, as I mentioned there, it's a very diverse landowner base within the watershed, private lands to U.S. Forest, National Forest System lands, Denver Water, some state lands, some local kind of municipal lands through county parks, those sorts of things. This figure here shows a couple of the sub-watersheds that have been priorities for us and what the land ownership looks like in this area. And what we've really tried to do is work across the boundaries in the sense that we build from existing treatments on U.S. Forest System lands and often are working on private lands in this particular partnership project, but we try to align the work that we're doing on private lands with areas that have been treated on the public lands as well. Another benefit to this is the landowner outreach campaigns and a few workshops and field trips that we've been able to put on, and then the establishment of demonstration sites within this landscape where we can take individual landowners, groups of folks to come out and actually see the work going on the ground. And then in terms of leveraged funding, I mentioned not only working with existing funds, but continuing to try to bring new funding to the project. And we have had a lot of support currently through the National Cohesive Wildfire Management Strategy of the U.S. Forest Service, also the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program of the Forest Service, some corporate support, and then the utilities, Denver Water in particular, of course, has been very active in this area through their Forest to Faucets program. And then more recently, evaluating this payment for watershed or ecosystem services model, and in particular, a water fund model. And Steve mentioned that as well. And so this, we think, provides a good structure for this type of work, in part because it's replicable across different geographies. So it basically kind of provides a structure that can then be implemented sort of regardless of the actual geography or watershed that you're working in. But the basic idea is that it's linking investors with land stewards, with the water fund itself serving as sort of the liaison with a particular role around identifying watershed priorities, serving as the fiscal agent, so managing the funding and how that funding hits the ground, and then serving also as an advisory board to the overall effort itself, and then very importantly, looking as it relates to the monitoring data, looking at the performance-based accounting and just how we're doing from a return on investment standpoint. In terms of the structure that I mentioned, we like it, again, from the standpoint of it providing a replicable structure that can be adopted in a number of different settings. But the basic outline is focus on governance, science-based decision-making, finance, work on the ground, and then the way in which that work is communicated. And we're looking at it in particular as it relates to finance and the potential for a water fund model to bring in non-traditional investors in this type of work. So we often rely on grant funding and other types of programs to support the work. And with the idea in a water fund, it's really aimed at bringing in private sector investment, corporations, other stakeholders that have an interest in water resource protection. So we're looking to it, it's still very much in a kind of developmental phase, I would say, not only in Colorado, but in a lot of other parts in the country. But there are good examples of where water funds have been implemented and where they're working to bring in some creative financing mechanisms. So with that, I will end and turn it back over to Caitlin. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Rob. Let me get the next slide ready to go. All right, sorry about that. So thanks again, Rob. So finally, I'd like to introduce our last speaker, Ellen Roberts. And Ellen is a lawyer in Durango, focusing on water law and natural resources consulting, especially in forest health and watershed protection issues. She is currently working on projects with the Colorado State Forest Service in partnership with the San Juan National Forest and the Nature Conservancy. She served in the Colorado State House and Senate for a combined 10 years of public service, representing many counties in the southwestern part of the state. And while in the legislature, Ellen sponsored many pieces of water and forest health legislation and served as chairwoman of the Water Resources and the Forest Health Interim Committees. So Ellen, you should be,
okay.
Go right ahead.
All right, great. Thank you, Caitlin, and thanks to everybody who's on the webinar and the other presenters. This is an area that I'm pretty passionate about, and I would mention that you may hear a helicopter in the background now and then, and that's because we still have the 416 fire north of Durango that's ongoing. And so quite seriously, we are still very much fighting that wildfire. I thought it might be interesting for people to know, since we are a long ways from Denver area, that this is a fire that started on June 1st, and it's currently at about 35,000 acres burned and 36% contained. So it's anticipated that the 416 fire is going to continue through the month really of July, and we've had over 1,000 firefighters on the scene. It is out headed into the woods and away from the town of Hermosa, but this has definitely had a huge impact on Durango and Hermosa and Silverton, and I know a lot of our neighbors in every direction have been smelling the smoke, as we still are. So again, this is personal, but it also is something that many great people are working on. So the question here is, the state of Colorado and the people that live in it, we have choices, and that is what I'm going to try and cover in my slides, but that basically if we keep doing what we've been doing, we're going to keep getting these catastrophic wildfires. And I think you've already heard from Steve and from Rob that there are many alternative paths for us to take, and I hope that we will. Caitlin, you want to? Thank you. And I should have mentioned too that the 416 fire, and we actually have a second fire that's ongoing a little closer to Cortez and that area, but currently the 416 fire is at $20 million since June 1st. And one of the questions would be, what could we have done with that $20 million in a more proactive way? So as was mentioned, I served at the Colorado State Legislature for 10 years. And this is after that 10 years of watching how the state funds or helps supplement the funding for this kind of work. This slide, I hope, shows you why severance tax, which is our tax revenue from oil and gas, why this is not a good way to try and help supplement the funding for the work that needs to be done. And both Steve and Rob have mentioned that we need to move on a much larger scale than we've been doing. And if we tie severance tax as our principal source of funding at the state level, you can see that in 2016 is not a good place to be, and actually it's worse in 2018. A lot of words here, but basically, again, trying to underscore the idea that we do have choices. We can move in a proactive way, and we want it to be science-based, as Rob was mentioning. We want it to be collaborative. We need to work in the Front Range, particularly the wildland-urban interface, or the WUI, which we have many people who are projected to move into the state of Colorado. But many of those areas are going to be impacted by fire. Fire is part of Colorado's natural landscape and ecology, so we need to be thinking about that. The U.S. Forest Service and the State Forest Service definitely are science-based forestry principles are guiding the work that needs to be done. One of the things that people often forget is it's not just the immediate cost of the fire, but it's the rollout of costs to public health and safety. It was mentioned the public infrastructure and the Silverthorne fire that was at risk. but you can think about reservoirs and having to dredge reservoirs, the roads that can be damaged, the flooding that occurs later. Then we have the power grid that crosses many areas of our state that are at risk for fire and fire damage. We also have had a number of catastrophic wildfires where Coloradans and firefighters have lost their lives. So it's not just about money and property damage, but it is about human lives and also the watersheds, the soils, habitat, and again, the flooding damage. So the last little bullet there, I guess, is to talk about, so if we know all these things, why haven't we done something about it sooner? And it takes putting money into this upfront, not always after the fire. It isn't a one-time deal. Homeowners can do work around their homes, but it needs to be continued. The community education with the number of people who move in who are not from fire ecology states need to be educated about the risks that we have and also the role that fire plays, and then political will. So legislators, whether they're at the state and federal level, are often struggling to figure out how to make budgetary decisions, and if a fire is not immediately in front of them, they may be thinking about spending money in different areas of the budget. So I am very interested in seeing us move proactively, but it's going to take a lot more than any one individual. It's the collaborations that have been mentioned, but also our elected officials are really moving in that proactive way. This is what we would like the forest to look like. This is what the forest can look like with appropriate thinning. This is a picture that Rob, through the Nature Conservancy, provided, but it's a much different landscape than what we're looking at, and what many of us have learned, or over time have thought of as healthy forests, come to find out that they're not at all, that this is what we should be striving for. Fire breaks, Steve had mentioned this. This picture actually comes from the 416 fire that I was mentioning earlier that's still happening north of Durango. But here we've got a fire crew that's out there creating that fire break. It would be a lot better to be able to get those in place prior to a fire. And again, using appropriate science and placement of roads, I think that work can be done well by the U.S. Forest Service. But we do need to give them the resources so that they can get in and get that work done before the fire moves in. Colorado's future, the graph on the left comes from the Colorado State Demographer. It shows the obvious rapid increase in population growth in the state of Colorado. Vast majority of people will be moving into the Front Range. Again, underscores the need to deal with that Front Range, more urban density. And if you look to the right, that map is showing you this spring what our moisture content basically was. We did not, down in the southwest corner, the fact that we have the 416 fire and the Burrow fire are of no surprise to us. If you look at the colors there on that map, we knew we were ripe for wildfire season, but the whole state at different times will look like that. So we need to be prepared. This one, I don't expect to go through it line by line, but just want to point out that the Colorado State Legislature does have an interim committee called the Wildfire Matters Committee. One of the things that was put into place was the mitigation work to be done around a homeowner's property. And currently there's 100% tax credit available if there are up to $2,500. So one of the problems is getting homeowners aware of this and how it can benefit them and how it can benefit their property. But the state legislature is trying to provide some tools that it can, again, on a limited budget. We have here, obviously, the view that many of us down here in Southwest Colorado, unfortunately, are familiar of with the wildfire. But basically, again, what I think we need to shift from is being motivated from seeing pictures like this and work at the front end. By the time we get to a fire like this, it's too late to have done the kind of work that we would have done proactively. So it's a matter of getting people aware that investing at the front end is public safety. It is preventing fires like this. Prescribed burn has a very appropriate place in the toolbox to be dealt with, and prescribed burns are much better than wildfire that is left unchecked or trying to get control of that. So the state has invested a fair amount in air fleet and other tools, but again, by the time you're fighting the fire, we could do so much more with $20 million at the front end instead of trying to put out these fires. I think what we're trying to suggest here is that we could figure out some new solutions. It includes funding streams, finding funding streams in addition to state severance tax and federal funding. It was mentioned that we have some conservation finance tools that are being explored, which is a different stream of funding than we've had. Talking about homeowners, understanding that they have a responsibility to work on private lands. The State Forest Service is ready, willing, and able to help private landowners figure out what needs to be done. And the state legislature is trying to help in terms of how to fund those. Lastly, here is specific ideas for new funding. It was mentioned private sector. There is not much of a timber industry in the state of Colorado. Montrose Forest Products on the western slope has a nice large sawmill in Montrose. They are expanding that sawmill to take ponderosa pine from the southwest corner. They're expanding it with $20 million of investment. But it would be very important, in my view, that we find private sector possibilities for small business, for the timber industry to do the work that they can do, that this is really an all hands on deck kind of thing. We need the U.S. Forest Service, State Forest Service, TNC, other NGOs, but we need the private sector to be in part of the problem solving here to get the work done in an environmentally sustainable way. And we have a timeline that is not, I personally don't want to work on a 100-year timeline to get the work done that needs to get done. We all live in the path of fire, and so I think we want to move a little more quickly. I mentioned earlier the conservation finance options such as environmental impact bonds or forest resilience bonds, kind of a new discussion, but I think it's one that's going to get more and more attention, and hopefully we start exploring what we can be doing with that. Biomass utilization, that wood, which is something like junk wood, basically not able to be used for lumber or other kind of products. We've got to figure out what to do with that. Generating electricity or producing something called biochar, maybe wood pellets, get some value out of that wood to help fund the work that needs to be done, I think will be really important. And finally, I'd just say that if we put the resources to it, we definitely have the people who are committed to seeing a better future, forests that are healthy, watersheds that are protected. So again, I just come back to, I think we have some choices to make. They won't be easy ones, but I appreciate, Caitlin, very much that you've done this webinar, and I appreciate what you did with your Headwaters magazine issue by highlighting the connection between our water and our land. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ellen. So now I'd like to turn to all of our panelists to answer questions. If you joined the presentation late, if you'd like to pose a question, you'll just use the questions section of the GoToWebinar dashboard located on the side of your screen. And it looks like we already have a few questions coming in. So I'm unmuting Rob and Steve, so all three of you can respond. And the first question was from Amy Johnson. She said, Steve, who is on the Regional Water Board, and or how would an organization get involved?
Okay, so that's a good question. So we have focused that water board internally to try to get Forest Service affairs in order. That consists of 3 of our regional office directors and 3 forest supervisors right now. And so we have a kind of an intern with us now at a fairly high level who's really helping us organize that, and we are attempting to right now identify some of the issues that we're going to go after. So I think once we get organized, we'd be in a really good position to have representatives of that board reach out to some appropriate stakeholders to get their input on, and some of this will directly, some of the issues that they'll go after will directly be you know, as it relates to some of the stakeholder interests. And one example that comes to mind is, you know, we've got a lot of water utility partnerships right now. Well, are we leveraging those collectively in the best way possible? Is there a way that we can organize to bring different stakeholders to the mix in that water utility community to maximize our treatments and do them in the right place in the right way and really leverage them the way we need to?
All right, thank you. So next we have a longer question. Adrian at CSU says, it's inspiring to see Denver Water and similarly large utilities proactively engaging in wildfire-related watershed health partnerships. But I'm curious to know if smaller water utilities have the capacity to engage in these efforts. Also, at the smallest scale, are domestic water well users in the wildland-urban interface involved in wildfire-related watershed partnerships?
Is that, I mean, I can start to answer it, and maybe I'd like to get Ellen and Rob's input too. Yeah, I mean, the answer is yes. There's smaller utilities involved. We've got, you know, some groups in Wyoming in particular. Buffalo Municipal Watershed is engaged. We also have several other small ones in Colorado as well. We really focus, as you would expect, on some of the immediate needs. But yeah, they're out there, and we're doing work with them. The well users, I can't really answer that question. We have not had that situation, so I don't know if others have thoughts.
Well, this is Ellen, and coming from the rural remote corner, and we had the Missionary Ridge Fire in 2002, which had huge impacts on our water utilities, even though they're smaller. Certainly had the impacts there. And then again with the 416 fire that we're dealing with right now, both the Lohr Water Conservancy District and Southwestern Water Conservation District are very concerned and interested in finding some solutions to move in our area as well. And there has been raised the concern about people who have wells in the Animas Valley, which is going to be where the drainage out of the 416 fire, a lot of the ash and sediment and other things that will come down from the mountainside will end up in the wells in the Animas Valley. So I think all water providers and well owners are going to find that they're impacted by this particular fire. But I know those 2 water districts down here in Southwest Colorado have been active collaborative partners and at the table trying to figure this out. So I think there's a role for all. Colorado Water Congress has also identified forest health and water quality and quantity as being a top priority for the Water Congress, and that includes water providers of all sizes and irrigation ditch companies as well.
Yeah, and just one other point to add on to that, this is Steve, is that, there are a lot of very small smaller watershed collaboratives going on all around the state. And some of these local water utilities are often a part of those. And so I think that's a step in the right direction. This one's a little bigger, but the 232 work in southwestern Colorado that I know Ellen can probably speak to a little more eloquently than I, that's another good example of how you're getting a bunch of different local stakeholders involved to make a collective larger difference.
And if I could jump in on the 232, I think it might be interesting for the webinar participants. This is something that is cross-boundary, really talking that landscape scale is critically important, but that we also start breaking down the barriers that exist with geopolitical boundaries like state lines. So the 232 collaborative is Southwest Colorado and Northwest New Mexico, and really looking at the connection between the Rio Grande in the San Luis Valley down into New Mexico, and the implications of a fire that might occur in Colorado but has serious consequences to the water supply down in Albuquerque. And I think we might have some folks who are from other states, maybe to the north or elsewhere, and I think that is the way we need to move. And I'm really pleased that the U.S. Forest Service has been such a strong supporter, as well as the State Forest Service in both Colorado and New Mexico, in working on breaking down those geopolitical barriers.
And this is Rob. I'll chime in just to say that that a lot of our work on the Front Range has been with utilities, and in addition to Denver Water, Colorado Springs Utilities has been very engaged in work in the Fountain Creek watershed. Aurora Water has been very engaged. I live in Fort Collins and do a good bit of work in the Cache-La-Poudre watershed, and Fort Collins Utilities has been really supportive of the watershed health, forest health focused work in that watershed. And Steve mentioned the local watershed coalition groups that are really instrumental in that effort as well. And we're definitely seeing that kind of that model play out, where the utilities combined with some of the local coalitions. The Coalition for the Poudre River Watershed and my watershed is really active in that area, as is a water fund known as Peaks to People Water Fund that's developing in the Cache-La-Poudre and Big Thompson watersheds. So I do think the utilities play a really important role, and I've been very appreciative of the support that they've given to the effort so far. And unfortunately, I can speak a little less to the issue of well users. It's a good question, and certainly one that I think we need to look into a little more.
Okay, another question that's kind of along the same lines of inclusivity. As far as grant funding for mitigation, fire mitigation, how do the poorer counties work into this vision to be proactive? Does anyone have thoughts on that? How do the poorer counties work into the vision to be proactive?
Well, I mean,
Caitlin, I would. Oh,
go ahead.
Sorry. Go ahead.
No, you got it.
I was just going to point out that the fact that this state income tax credit, so the poorer counties, I'm going to guess, are less populated, and without knowing exactly where in the state we're talking about, the fact that there are FireWise programs, the Colorado State Forest Service is in all four corners of the state, so outreach to the State Forest Service in terms of what individual homeowners, let's say somebody lives in a forested area, has a cabin or whatever that is on private or state land, people could certainly reach out to the State Forest Service, or if there's a local FireWise, or I know Archuleta County has a real strong program, as does La Plata and Montezuma counties. So I'll let Rob and Steve speak to what that might look like on the Front Range, but I know that there are a lot of people, cooperative extension folks, who might also be able to help if it is private land.
Yeah, I would say from the Forest Service standpoint, you know, we're located all amongst rural communities, and we obviously, you know, when you're talking about resources at risk, one of the things that's identified is, you know, how much infrastructure, how much that infrastructure is worth when we are making investments. However, that doesn't mean that we ignore or treat some of those other areas differently. We work collaboratively with even small counties to really try to identify the highest risk acres to treat. So there are programs out there, and you know, a couple that comes to mind is our CFLR program on the Uncle Padre Plateau, for example. You know, that's just outside of Montrose, and you know, we've invested, you know, millions and millions of dollars, probably around, you know, $2 million a year out there for the last 7 years to do restoration work and in that community. So, you know, I think there's opportunities out there, and I think that some of these smaller communities have opportunities and means to get some of the work done in the highest priority areas.
All right. Another question, which areas will be more prone to fires due to climate change?
Well, I mean, we're seeing it in southwestern Colorado for sure. I think it starts in the southwest and it kind of moves its way up. I mean, we're drier in the southwest than we have been in probably 15 years or more. And it continues to get worse every year. We have less and less snowpack, increased temperatures. So I would say it probably starts in the southwest and moves up from there. That's my take, and I don't know, I'm sure, Rob, you probably have something to add there.
Yeah, I can jump in. Maybe a little more as it relates to the forest types in particular. And, you know, most often we've seen fires in the last 20 years or so, and probably more so in that kind of ponderosa pine mixed conifer zone, and a little bit less in those higher elevation forests like spruce fir and lodgepole, in part because those forest types that are at lower elevations are just naturally drier to begin with, based on the fact that they are at lower elevation. So when we do get a drought, they're drier to begin with. We get an ignition with high winds and low relative humidities and all the factors that affect fire behavior, and then we have a big fire event. But I think increasingly with climate change, we'll continue to see fire not only in the lower elevation forests, but increasingly in those upper elevation forests. And I think some of the recent examples you pointed out earlier, Steve, the Buffalo fire up in Summit County, I think that's going to be where we're going to actually see a lot more fire in some of those higher elevation areas as well. So I think it's going to be kind of across the board in a lot of cases, and we need to be thinking in terms of across forest types and how we approach the climate change issue, and how we make the forest types more resilient, really regardless of the location.
If I might, I would also like to point out insect infestation has had a pretty significant impact on the forest, particularly, well, in the southwest corner, but obviously throughout the state. And the trees, the density of the trees, I think really also compromises the tree resilience, which I think is why we're also talking about thinning and prescribed burns and actual timber harvesting as being part of the solution. But we had a new insect infestation outbreak in southwest Colorado just in the last year or so, which is compounds the problem in addition to climate change.
All right, we have just about a minute left. I'm going to read one more question, and we have a few questions that have gone unanswered, so I'll email our panelists and see if we can get some answers to those. But as a final question, do the three of you have thoughts on whether the public is ready to accept larger treatments and aesthetic changes as those kinds of projects occur more frequently?
I mean, from my standpoint with the Forest Service, the key is collaboration and understanding, what stakeholders want and how we can deliver that for them. When we have a collaborative process where everybody has a chance to air out that's science-based, I think science-based is key. When you can show the research that identifies how these treatments can impact landscapes and how they're necessary, it becomes a lot easier for us to do that work, and the public is much more accepting of it. It is also easier when you see large-scale catastrophic wildfires in people's backyards and insect infestations like we've had with the spruce beetle in southwestern Colorado, and then along the Front Range, northern Front Range, with the pine beetle. People don't like to see that stuff. So as we develop potential projects, emphasizing the fact that we're trying to prevent these things moving forward always gets the public in a better place. And then the other thing that I also emphasize, what Ellen pointed out, was that we don't do a good enough job of identifying opportunity costs. We spend $35 million on fires in our region already, and that's about what we spend on restoration efforts in Colorado annually as a whole. So, and then that's not even taken into account other things such as what water utilities have to pay when they have to, sedimentation and reservoirs and things like that. So I think a better job of opportunity costs helps the public understand the needs for these treatments.
Yeah, and I would just jump in quickly, if you don't mind, Caitlin, to just point out that is a very important component, social acceptability. So I do appreciate the question. And one thing that I think we need to do a better job of is around education and looking to the science that actually, tells us that a lot of the forests were much more open historically than they are currently. And we're, of course, used to a much more dense forest condition because that's what we see often every day. But naturally, historically, with intact disturbances like fire, these systems were much more open. And so the goal of a lot of these treatments is to create that more open condition that is going to be more resilient to future fire.
Can I add one thing? No, go ahead, Alan. Go ahead. Sorry.
Well, I was just going to say that I have little to add to what you two just said because I think you said it so well. I would say that when fire strikes, there is an opportunity for education. And I can tell you that the U.S. Forest Service and the folks that have been fighting the 416 fire have done a tremendous job on a more than once a day using Facebook, using social media as a way to educate the public. And the communities around here obviously have been very concerned about the fire and the smoke impacts, but the U.S. Forest Service is very deftly using it very well, social media, to teach people about fire and but even going in a more proactive direction. So I think it's about community and education, but using every tool that we have, including the media. But social media offers us a chance to capture people when they're most interested, and I think they've done a great job here, and I expect that'll continue.
Okay, let me just offer one other thing here real quick. I would say that the other thing that's important for the public to understand, and we get criticized a lot from some of the environmental groups on this, but we live in an anthropogenically altered landscape, and there's places where we can manage for what historically, ecologically, like a historic condition that we had ecologically, but there's places that we can't. And I think that folks need to recognize that and understand that we've got a lot at risk on the landscape to manage for, and we're trying to balance those risks. And there's going to be certain areas where we have to do things a little bit differently in light of the fact that there's however many people live on the Front Range, or that we've got a tremendous wild and urban interface. So I just leave you with that.
Yep, great point. Thanks, Steve.
All right. Thank you all. For any folks still participating in the webinar on the line, we'll follow up by email with answers to those couple remaining questions. And I'll also send out the recording probably next week for both of those emails. Again, we encourage you to take the next step by checking out Water Education Colorado's Headwaters magazine and website for original reporting and other upcoming events and opportunities. Thank you again to our wonderful presenters, and thanks to everyone in the audience for your participation and questions. That is all. Have a great day, everyone.
All right, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.